Ernfred Anderson was born on August 28, 1896, in Asperud, a small village in Skåne, in the southern fertile farmland region of Sweden. Anderson grew up in a middle-class family who encouraged creative endeavors. His mother was an accomplished weaver, and it seems she passed on her interests in art and design to her children, for each of them followed a path in a creative field. At an early age, Anderson knew that his calling was in the arts. One can see this from a poignant photo montage he made of a sculpture he created, superimposed over himself while drawing in a room surrounded by his artwork. Anderson, at the age of 16, the youngest of the family, went abroad to study art at the University of Lucerne, Switzerland. He lived with his oldest brother, Anders, who was a practicing artist and interior designer. While attending classes, Anderson apprenticed with Anders and learned the trade he would bring with him to the United States. Young Anderson sent quite a few hand-sketched postcards to his mother, informing her of his travels and well-being while at school. In 1915, Anderson decided to move to the United States, where the economy was booming and the prospects for an industrious young person were promising. He first stayed in Providence, Rhode Island, with another brother, Hugold, who had preceded him and was already established with his own tool and die factory. There is not very much information about the initial year or two of Anderson's life in Providence, other than a few photographs. Yet this became a pivotal time for Anderson, as he found his love and muse Ragnhild Weckman, also an immigrant, but from Finland. Anderson and Weckman were married in 1917, both 21 years of age. A year later, Ayla Cecilia was born. It was not until 1923 that their second daughter, Inga Sophia, was born, after they had moved to Brooklyn. While finding his footing in a new country, Anderson continued to draw, paint, and sculpt, and soon found a tribe of like-minded artists, most of whom were of Scandinavian origin. One of these persons was a seasoned landscape and portrait painter, Benjamin Orso Eggleston. Mr. Eggleston, being an influential artist and a member of the Salamagundi Club, Brooklyn Arts Club, and vice president of the Brooklyn Society of Artists, introduced Mr. Anderson to the art world then flourishing in Brooklyn and New York. Anderson began to see his future as an artist in Brooklyn, and so moved his new family to 169 7th Avenue in 1921. He set up a business as a decorator, specializing in modern art. These were the years of the Roaring Twenties, the Great Gatsby, and the boom of industrial growth in America. The Art Deco style became the symbol of this time, full of optimism about the future and a promise of a new and modern world. The young Anderson was inspired by this style and found his talents, while broad, were particularly adept with modeling clay in the Art Deco style. He continued to sculpt fine artworks on his own, but found his bread and butter as an applied artist designing interior and exterior detailing of architecture and furniture, then in great demand. One of the Scandinavian artists living in New York that Anderson got to know and was the most influenced by was the prominent Norwegian Art Deco sculptor Treve Hammer. It appears that Anderson worked for Hammer on several projects, one of which was the Stewart and Company building facade in New York City. The bold block-like architecture was adorned with a monumental entrance of stylized nudes with nature, a hybrid of Art Deco and Art Nouveau that Anderson found compelling. This building later became Baumwood Teller, another clothier. Its owner, Henry Russell Hitchcock, dismantled the grand and beautifully sculpted entry designed by Hammer because of what he and other critics perceived as offensive nudes at the eye level. Anderson said that they were designed without clothing so as not to go out of style. The architect, Eli Jacques Kahn, replaced the entry with a more conventional and graphic Art Deco facade. This same building was later torn down and is now known as Trump Towers. The connection with Scandinavian artists continued to grow, and so did the beginnings of Anderson's civic interests that would blossom in his later years in Elmira, New York. Anderson, with Benjamin Eggleston and Treve Hammer, contacted the Scandinavian American Society in New York and created a subgroup called the Scandinavian American Artists Society. This group curated yearly art shows at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Pratt Institute of Art, the Brooklyn Society of Artists, and various other galleries throughout Brooklyn and New York City. This organization is still in existence today and continues to promote Scandinavian art and culture in the States. Eggleston and Anderson often exhibited together in other venues and even sat for each other as subjects of art. Eggleston painted at least 2 portraits of Mr. Anderson that we know of, one now owned by Elmira College, and the other, called the Sculptor, was destroyed in one of the many floods in Elmira. These floods and other calamities claimed many works by Anderson over the years, and it is probable that one or both of the busts of Eggleston were casualties. Through the 1920s, Anderson continued to pursue his fine art passions with pieces such as The Pearl, Repose, and other subject studies in the Art Deco, Art Nouveau styles. Anderson's artistic capabilities over his lifetime were very broad and encompassed all aspects of an aesthetic profession and lifestyle. As he worked in clay rather than stone, Anderson would insist that he was a modeler, not a sculptor. Not all artists would recognize this fine distinction then or today. For a number of years, the Andersons enjoyed the benefits of a prosperous business and the bohemian lifestyle of a young artistic couple attending the fashionable art balls in New York City. Unfortunately, the first of a series of catastrophes changed all this, with a fire in their flat in Brooklyn that destroyed much of his early works. The Andersons decided that it would be best to send their daughters to Ragnhild's family in Finland while they regrouped and found a place to live. The Andersons took a while to recover their business, and after a few years brought the children home, only to be hit again with the next trial, the crash of 1929. When investments failed and once wealthy patrons disappeared overnight. Anderson and his family floundered on for a while, moving from apartment to apartment between Brooklyn and New York City. This included a stint living in the Osborne, now untouchable real estate, but then cheap artist housing. For many a person, and no less for artists, this was a dreadful time. In 1933, after 13 years in Brooklyn, Anderson moved his family to Elmira, New York. He decided to make the move after visiting the fellow Scandinavian and accomplished expressionist painter Lars Hofstrup at a gathering of the Seneca Art Association. Hofstrup encouraged Anderson to move to Elmira and hosted his family when they first arrived in the area. The two friends worked together on many projects and were prominent artists and advocates for art in the region. Anderson and Hofstrup collaborated on a number of ventures, one project being the resurrection of the Elmira Art Club, for which Anderson was the first president. This organization, which brought art in the Elmira community to new heights, still exists today as the Elmira Regional Art Society. Again, in 1938, Anderson and Hofstrup opened the Pine Gallery on Dry Run Road outside of Pine City in an old barn that they renovated. Many a gathering of fellow artists and students of art spent time at this art colony coined with the Scandinavian name Artsthorpe. Anderson thought creativity to be a universal desire and not to be left to the intellectual few. Art should be attainable to all persons, he thought. He developed this theory through his years teaching art to children at the local elementary schools and adults at Elmira College. He and Lars Hofstrup took advantage of the new continuing education program at Elmira College and taught art classes in Elmira and Corning. The course became so popular that they expanded the program to include students from the full-time college and had to move the department to the infirmary that they renovated to accept the growing numbers of students. Anderson was a noticeable figure in the Elmira community for enthusiastically championing art through various venues. He strongly believed in civic engagement and early on joined organizations such as the Rotary Club and the Junior League. He was a charismatic individual and used this charisma to advocate for art or just about anything he believed in. One such a time was when he was trying to get fellow Rotarians to pony up funds for the Boy Scouts. Anderson shouted that he would shave off his beard if one more person would donate to the cause. Well, someone did, and it turned into a spectacle with a mock arrest, complete with handcuffs and a restraining jacket. He always loved an opportunity to play the clown. One of the first sculptures Anderson modeled when he arrived in Elmira was the portrait bust of Mark Twain. This proved to be a significant piece of artwork, for it gave Anderson his first notable break as a fine artist. The bust, now on display at the Samuel Clemens Center in downtown Elmira, was considered by Jarvis Langdon the finest likeness of Mark Twain he had ever seen. This artwork spawned the commission to create a monument over the grave of Mark Twain at the Woodlawn Cemetery. In 1937, Clara Clemens Gabrilowicz, after being impressed by the accuracy of the bust, commissioned Anderson to create the monument to her father and husband that is there today. The creation and then dedication of the Mark Twain monument was quite the production. An excerpt from the Boston Herald newspaper of December 6, 1937, said that the Mark Twain shaft was viewed by throngs to watch the granite marker pass through the gates of the Quincy, Massachusetts quarry on its way to Elmira, New York. Once it arrived in Elmira, an elaborate production was staged in the downtown with the aid of students and faculty of the Elmira College. The monument stands today in Woodlawn Cemetery and is still visited each year by the many Mark Twain devotees. These were inspired years for Anderson, for it was in 1937 he sculpted the glider. a sculpture that was first exhibited in the Elmira Area Soaring Corporation headquarters for the 8th Soaring Meet in Elmira. The sculpture was exhibited along with a black and white brush drawing depicting the first soaring meet at Harris Hill. Anderson received an award for the rendering while on display at the National Aeronautical Art Exhibition in Los Angeles, California. Later, the glider was exhibited at the 1939 New York World's Fair, the dawn of a new day, to represent the birth of aviation in New York State. In this same year, Anderson petitioned the Works Progress Administration, the WPA Federal Art Program, to create a sculpture for the Elmira Reformatory. The WPA was part of the New Deal, created as a relief program to employ artists that were struggling as a result of the Great Depression. Many artists of all genres were recipients of this program that provided some of the most important artworks of this period. Anderson was given 6 months to create The Builders of Men, which was the motto of the reformatory at the time. Inmates from the reformatory stood as models for the statue and helped him cast the sculpture in the reformatory foundry. Anderson taught a class in sculpting and foundry work to interested inmates while he worked on his own project. The success he had with working with these inmates reinforced his belief that art could and should be attainable to all people. In 1942, Anderson became the director for the Arnott Art Gallery and remained in that position for 22 years. In this capacity, Anderson brought many works of art and artists to Elmira, and the gallery grew as an institution of influence in the community. He judiciously made improvements to the gallery facilities and was known to personally trim branches and paint the fences on the museum grounds. Anderson expanded his involvement with civic organizations in Elmira and the region. He maintained relationships with the Scandinavian American Society and continued to exhibit his personal artworks at the Brooklyn Museum of Art and Pratt Institute. Anderson cultivated new relationships at Cornell College of Fine Arts and Architecture and the University of Buffalo, Hobart College, and many others. The directorship provided Anderson with a platform he needed to speak about what art meant to him. He lectured extensively on various aspects of fine art and architecture and worked to raise the discourse on art in Elmira and in the region. He continued to speak about art as a forum for all persons and even attempted to write a book on the subject, but never completed it. He spoke unapologetically and often made it clear in lectures that he was not a fan of the growing movement of modern art. Anderson truly believed it a fad, and that popular sentiment would eventually drive it away. He went even as far as to attempt painting in the style of Picasso and other modernists, only to be disappointed that his paintings would sell faster and often for more money than his personal fine art. In 1944, Anderson was commissioned to design a plaque for the USS Elmira Victory, one of a number of ships built during World War II under the Emergency Shipbuilding Program. While researching a design for the project, he looked to the Elmira City Seal for inspiration. He noticed that the depiction of the headdress of the Iroquois Native American tribe on the seal was incorrectly represented. Anderson petitioned City Hall to alter the headdress to a single feather and simpler dress, and offered to make the changes. Anderson's version is now the official city seal. Much of Anderson's commissioned work consisted of portrait busts and bas-reliefs for individual patrons and memorials. One of his more notable subjects was Grantland Rice, the famous sports writer. Vanderbilt University still has Anderson's bust of Rice on display in the Archive Library. Anderson's other more notable public works in Elmira are the Edward Dunn Monument at Dunn Field, the Eugene Zimmerman Monument in Teal Park, the Rufus Stanley Plaque at Harris Hill, the Francis Parker Monument, and the Ernie Davis Tribute Plaque. He was also commissioned by the Elmira College to create the bas-relief depiction of the arts on the exterior of the Fine Arts Building. Many of Anderson's personal artworks had a religious theme, and while he was not a church-going man, he seemed to be concerned with religious subject matter, and in particular the theme of end of life. His paintings and sculptures often showed ghost-like figures in serene and eerie natural settings, or depictions of graves, the devil, or the skeletons in comical dark humor expressions. But just as often, the figures he sculpted or painted were of angels ascending to heaven, or versions of the Madonna and Child theme. He had a facility with the human body and was adept at bringing out the fluidity of the female form and elevating this form to angelic heights. He would fuse body and nature in symbolic expressions of idea and emotion. You see this in a number of his artworks, such as the lily, the glider, and the winged angel. The winged angel was a memorial sculpture to his wife Ragnhild, who suffered from ill health and died in 1952 at the early age of 56. Anderson took a trip to Finland and Sweden that year and scattered Ragnhild's ashes in the Baltic Sea as she requested. Later, Anderson would remarry a family friend, Helga Christensen, and they were together until Anderson's death in 1983. While at the Arnott Art Gallery, Anderson continued to experiment with his talent. He created numerous stained glass windows. The most complete and recently restored example are the windows of the North Presbyterian Church on College Avenue in Elmira. Anderson maintained his love of creating art late into his life. He wrote a short children's story called The Goose Boy that was an autobiography about his escapades as a young 8-year-old child when he lived in Sweden. He created pencil illustrations and a small sculpture of himself as a young boy with a goose. His family has recently put the drawings and story together in a self-published book. Over Ernfred Anderson's 66-year career, his artworks were exhibited by numerous museums and galleries. While Anderson was an accomplished artist, his biggest influence was in terms of bringing art to the public discourse. He is remembered by his students as a strict critic and as a man who was sometimes outlandish, often funny, and always outspoken. He could be seen on the Elmira College campus walking purposely with his art smock flying behind him. He was eccentric. He withstood being ridiculed by an unenlightened public for having his students draw from live nude models in scathing letters to the editor in the Elmira Star-Gazette, and people putting tarps over his nude sculptures while on display at the Steele Memorial Library. Yet through all this, he remained boldly resolute in believing in the creative process and art as a form of self-expression for all and for the right to do so. Thank you for viewing this abbreviated history of Ernfred Anderson, the sculptor.